Hello students, today we will discuss about Tantrism. Now, before elaborating on what Tantrism stood for, we would first like to give a brief introduction to the subject. Now, the term Tantrism is derived from the word Tantra, which were a series of esoteric texts, i.e., texts having a secret meaning to them. These were divulged by masters or preceptors to select initiates or disciples. Unlike the more traditionally known or popular texts like the Vedas, the epics, or the Puranas, they promised an immediate path to spiritual liberation, i.e., moksha. So, while moksha could take several years, decades, and even lifetimes to transform the soul or consciousness, Tantra, on the other hand, involved the harnessing of the natural powers of both the body and the mind by using some special techniques to accelerate the process of spiritual liberation. Now, the early history of Tantrism, its chronology, its initial locale, its core ideas and practices are perhaps quite difficult to comprehend because of their variety and the secrecy that has always enshrouded them. In early medieval India, for instance, Tantrism was a common element of all major religions, be they Shaiva, Shakto, Buddhist, or even Jainism. Interestingly, Hindu and Buddhist Tantra share some broad similarities, although there were points of differences in their philosophical understanding between them. By pronouncing the right formula, i.e., mantra, in the correct manner, or by drawing the correct magical symbol, i.e., yantra, one might force the gods to bestow magical power on the worshipper and lead him to the highest bliss. The development of Tantrism is traced from the pre-Vedic times to the evolution of the concept of Shakti in Indian religious thought. Tantrism drew on diverse sources of inspiration, including the Vedas, Mimamsha, Shankho, Yoga, and Vedanta. But it nonetheless developed its own unique characteristics along the way. Evidence for the worship of tantric deities go back to the 5th century when some of the tantric texts came to be composed. The early medieval period, in fact, saw a further development of tantric cults and practices. Energy, i.e., Shakti, is conceived of as feminine and is central to the tantric view of the universe and liberation. Tantric practice is called sadhana. There existed, in fact, a mutual influence between tantra and bhakti as well, both being contemporaneous. Initiation or dikha into a sect involved ritual initiation, an important part of which was the imparting of a secret mantra by the guru to the initiate. Mantras, i.e., prayers and formulae, and bijos, i.e., syllables associated with various deities believed to have a mystic potency in them, have an important place in Tantrism. Now, talking about the characteristic features of Tantrism, although some of the distinctive features of Tantra include mantras or sacred words or spells, yet this was not unique to Tantra. Why? Because they were at least as old as Atharva Veda itself, which contained several such mantras or spells performed during rituals. And yet, the Tantras of Tantric Hinduism were indeed unique in that they were bestowed with special powers of their own. In Tantric rituals, abstract geometric diagrams known as yantras, mandalas, or chakras were extremely important. These were sacred, often symmetrical designs personifying particular deities or spiritual entities of the four directions along with the center, that were often used as objects of visualization or meditation, having thus a cosmic symbolic aspect to them. Sacred symbolic gestures, known as mudras, also played an important part. Hatajog postures and meditation, i.e., dhyana, were also important. Sexual symbolism and magic were other key features of Tantrism. All these are supposed to be harnessed towards awakening the Kundalini energy that lies coiled like a serpent within the body, drawing it upwards towards union with the Supreme Being. The notion of pujo or worship in Tantra involves transforming the worshipper into the deity. It is often associated with the five elements, i.e., the Pancho Tattva or the Pancham Koro, also known as the five M's, which is the Tantric term for the five transgressive substances used in Tantric practices, namely modo or alcohol, mangsho or meat, motsho or fish, mudra, generally symbolic hand gestures, but here also it denotes parched grain, and moithuna, which is the sexual intercourse. Shobo sadhana is regarded as one of Tantra's most important, most difficult, and the most secret of rituals. Importantly, in Tantra, our bodies are considered sacred. Our bodies, in fact, are our temples, forming a microcosm of their own. Yet, what appears paradoxical is the fact that although this perhaps makes Tantra a body-positive philosophy, yet, at the same time, we are not solely our bodies. And so, Tantra asks us not to overtly over-identify with our body. Now, speaking of chakras and kundalini, Tantric views of chakras influenced other sects. The chakra was the center of prana, which was the breath energy in the body. Nari formed the channel of prana. Kundalini formed the vital energy, as I said, coiled at the base of the spine that was to be awakened and transformed by tantric practices. The Kubichko Mata Tantra was an 11th century text that described the 6 chakras along with the center or the Sahasrara. John Woodruff even popularized the 7 chakra system in the West. The sects that came to worship feminine divinities were known as Tantric, i.e., coming from the word Tantra or scriptures, Shaktik, or their worship of the Shakti or personified energy of the god, or even the left hand from the fact that the goddess sits on the left of her lord. Tantrism was divided into a number of sects, the principal ones being associated with the worship of Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti. The various sects had their own texts, most of the important ones being written in Sanskrit. The most important early tantric sect among the Vaishnavas was the Pancho Ratra. The Shohojiyas of Bengal were a later sect belonging to the tantric variety of Vaishnavism. The Shoibo tantric sects such as the Kapalikas, the Kalamukas, and the Nathas came to the fore in the early medieval period. Apart from the existence of probably small groups of tantric practitioners, there was the larger phenomenon of a widespread impact of tantrism on non-tantric cults and traditions. Now, speaking of the various classifications of tantra, we have what is known as Kriya Tantra or Action Tantra, Chorja Tantra or Conduct Tantra, Yoga Tantra, which was the last and the highest of the outer tantras, and here external rites were seen as much less important as internal practices. Anuttara Yoga Tantra, which was the supreme form of the four tantras. Besides, there were also the right hand and the left hand tantra. The right hand tantra, the Dakshina Kara, do not use taboo practices, while the left hand tantra or the Bhamakara handed human remains, skulls, and cremated ash included, which made them overcome the fear of death. They even consumed meat, alcohol, cannabis, corpses, blood, and even menstrual blood, which induced them to overcome fear or even the disgust of impurity. Prakriti refers to the basic cosmic material that is the root of all beings, while Purusha is the spirit or conscious energy that governs life and reality. Purusha exists beyond the realms of time and space to combine with Prakriti to form this life of creation. Tantra considers Godhead as involving the union of the masculine and the feminine aspect, i.e., the union of the Purusha with the Prakriti. There was, in fact, a close relationship between the Shaiva and the Shakta cults, as the deities, both Shiva and Shakti, were considered closely related. The tantric sects of early medieval India, who worshipped feminine divinities, gave women an important place in their cult and instituted orders of female ascetics. Now, we have also to study about tantric rites. Now, tantric rites involve the breaking of all the usual taboos of established religious orders, be they Hinduism, Buddhism, and such like. Members belonging to the tantric orders believed that the usual Hindu rites and ceremonies, though not wholly ineffectual, were only suitable for ordinary worshippers. The adepts, on the other hand, who had undergone long rites of initiation, practiced other ceremonies of much greater efficiency, similar to those of the Buddhists of the vehicle of the thunderbolt. Tantric yoga is usually divided into two stages: the generation stage, the Utpatikrama, and the completion stage, the Nishpannakrama. In the generation stage, practice of deity yoga, i.e., the Devata yoga, one dissolves oneself and the world in emptiness and visualizes oneself as a cherished divinity. Now, as far as tantric practices were concerned, we can say that small groups of initiates met at night, often in a temple or a private house, but also frequently in a burning ground, among the bones of the dead. And what did they do here? They formed groups or circles seated around the circumference of a large circular magical diagram, which was called yantra or mandala, drawn on the ground. Though the members of the circle could include both Brahmanas and outcasts, there was, however, no class distinction at the ceremony. All were considered equal, and no ritual pollution occurred from their mutual contact. Tantric Buddhism did not neglect the techniques of mental training, which were part of all the chief religions of India, but their direction was altered. Their primary purpose was to obtain supernormal power. In fact, the practitioner of the system might so hypnotize himself so as to imagine that he was reborn from the womb of a Tara to kill his father, the Buddha, and take his place. In sexual union with a female devotee, he and his partner would become Buddha and Tara, or he himself might become Tara. In the sexual rites of Tantric Buddhism, all taboos were lifted. Even incest was permitted, for what was sin to the ignorant was virtue to the initiate. Drinking of alcohol, meat eating, killing of animals, and sometimes even the killing of human beings, every imaginable sin possible, were practiced at the tantric covens. Things such as these, however, were performed under strictest control and only by initiates at sacred ceremonies. Intriguingly enough, like the Bengali tantricist of later times, the Vajrayana initiate might, in his ordinary life, be a normal man, whose occasional religious debauchery served as a catharsis to his evil psychological propensities and was of real help to him in leading the good life that he understood as he understood it. The earliest known datable Buddhist Tantra is possibly the Mahavairochana Tantra, which was mentioned and collected by the Chinese pilgrim Wu Xing around circa 680 CE. Among the many formulae of Tantric Buddhism, one is specially famous, the 6 syllables or the Sadaksara, Om Mani Padme Hum, still written and repeated thousands of times daily in Tibet. This phrase, the jewel is indeed in the lotus, may be sexual in significance, mystically repeating the divine coitus of the heavenly Buddha and Progga Paramita and of Avalokiteshvara and his Tara. Now, speaking of Vajrayana Buddhism, which was a form of Tantric Buddhism that developed in India and neighboring countries, including Tibet, and this marked the transition from Mahayana speculative thought to the enactment of Buddhist ideas in individual life. Contemporary historians of Buddhist studies have argued that Vajrayana Buddhism dates to the Tantric era of early medieval India. The simplest correlation between the Vedic and the Tantric is that whereas the Vedas emphasize the Jyotirmaya Purusha, i.e., the being or the person made of light, the Tantras emphasize the Shaktimaya Devi, the goddess made of energy. And yet, light and energy as consciousness and force are but one. Vajrayana Buddhism also defines Tantra as a means to channel the energy of desire and transform the experience of pleasure into a realization of enlightenment. In Buddhist thought, Tantra refers to a spiritual path comprising 3 stages, i.e., the basis or ground, which is the person practicing the system, the way or path of meditation, purifying the practitioner, and lastly, the result or fruition, which is the experience of awareness. Traditional Vajrayana sources say that the Tantras and the lineage of Vajrayana were taught by Shakyamuni Buddha and other figures such as the Bodhisattva Vajrapani and Padma Shambhava. Speaking of the vehicle of the thunderbolt, quite early in the history of the great vehicle, feminine divinities found their way into the Buddhist order. One such was Pragya Paramita, the perfection of insight, i.e., the personification of the qualities of the Bodhisattva. Subsequently, the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, who were thought of as male, were, like the gods of Hinduism, endowed with wives who were the active aspect, i.e., the force or potency, that is, Shakti, of their husbands. The Buddhist god was believed to be transcendental and aloof, while the goddess remained active in the world. Hence, the god might be best approached through the goddess. The productive activity of the divine was thought of in terms of sexual union, an idea as old as the Rig Veda itself. With the spread of these ideas, sexual symbolism or even sexual intercourse as a religious rite were incorporated into the teachings of some schools both within Buddhism and Jainism. The followers of the new teaching taught that it could be best attained by acquiring magical power, which they called Vajra or thunderbolt or even diamond. Hence, the new school of Buddhism came to be known as Vajrayana or the vehicle of the thunderbolt. On the other hand, the lesser vehicle taught that release was obtained by the gradual loss of individuality through self-discipline and meditation, as against the great vehicle that suggested that the grace and help of the heavenly Buddhas and Bodhisattvas assisted the process. Even the Stobirobadins taught that the monk who reached a high stage of detachment and mental training acquired supernatural powers. At all times, there were freelance Buddhist monks who did not live regularly in monasteries under orthodox discipline and who attempted feats of sorcery and necromancy such as the Buddha is said to have condemned. It was perhaps among these freelancers that the idea of the new vehicle developed, to be codified and given dignity under the Pala kings of Bengal and Bihar. Even in the 7th century, Huan Sang found certain monasteries permeated with magical practices. Now, coming to the female divinities, especially the Matrikas, the Taras, and Kali, we can say that the tantric texts assert that only the goddess is capable of granting the dual aims of both mukti and bhakti. Hindu Tantrism, in fact, centers on the great goddess, i.e., the Devi or the Shining One, as the supreme deity and the divine mother. Matrikas or mother goddesses appear in groups of 7, i.e., the Shaptamatrikas, or in groups of 8, the Ashtamatrikas, who were both fearsome and protective. Besides Kali, the goddess of time, change, power, and destruction, was also the manifestation of the wrath of Durga. Like the Matrikas, Kali could be both a protector mother goddess as well as a fearsome destroyer of evil, even as she came to be worshipped by many Shaktas. The chief divinities of the new tantric sects were the savioresses or Tara, the spouses of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, something which we have just studied. There were also a host of lesser divinities, many called by the names of demons, such as the outcast women or the Matongis, the demonesses or the Pishachis, the sorceresses or the Yoginis, and the She-Ghouls or the Dakinis. Besides, a yogini was also a female master practitioner of Tantra and Yoga, as well as a formal term for respect for female Hindu or Buddhist spiritual teachers in the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and Greater Tibet. The Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, with their taras, were approximated to the less amiable members of the Hindu pantheon and were often depicted with arms in ferocious poses. It was also thought that these deities should be compelled rather than be persuaded. Now, we have almost reached the end of our lesson, and so by way of conclusion, I would like to add that Tantrism originated as a development within Hinduism during the first millennium CE and gradually developed into an actual pantheon by the end of the Gupta period. Besides, the spread of Buddhism to East Asia and Southeast Asia gave rise to the introduction and evolvement of Tantra in these regions of the world as well. Rooted in sacred instructional texts, Tantra is both a Hindu and a Buddhist philosophy which affirms all aspects of the material world as infused with divine feminine power. Tantrism, whether Buddhist or Hindu, can best be characterized as practices, a set of techniques with a strong focus on rituals and meditation by those who believe that it is a path to liberation that is characterized by both knowledge and freedom. Tantrism constitutes thus a unique religious movement combining magical and mystical elements, having sacred writings of their own. Tantra is thus a process of evolution of consciousness, focusing upon ritual aspects that involve the use of the physical in sacred and worshipful settings to access the supernatural. Thank you.